I came home from a peaceful trip, expecting the comfort of familiarity. Instead, I found a stranger's lock on my door and a sign in the yard announcing that my house had been sold. My daughter stood inside, calm and certain, telling me it was necessary to pay her husband's debts. In that moment, something deeper than betrayal cracked open. I had lost more than a home. I had lost the illusion that love alone protects you. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply smiled, because they had no idea what was coming next. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 72 years old, a widow, and the last full-time resident of a weathered wooden house facing the Atlantic Ocean in Charleston, South Carolina. The paint on the shutters has faded to a soft gray, and the porch boards creak beneath my feet, but the house still stands firm against the salt air and coastal winds. Some mornings, when the tide rolls in and the gulls circle low over the water, I feel as though the house is breathing with me, steady and patient, like an old companion that refuses to leave. My husband and I bought this place more than 40 years ago, when we were younger and stronger and willing to trade comfort for possibility. We saved for years, taking extra shifts and postponing small luxuries, until the day we signed the papers and walked through the front door, carrying nothing but hope and a second-hand sofa. Every corner of this house holds a piece of that life. The hallway still echoes with the laughter of birthday parties. The living room remembers storms that rattled the windows while we sat close together, listening to the wind howl like a living thing. The kitchen carries the faint memory of cinnamon and coffee on winter mornings. After my husband died of heart disease 8 years ago, the house changed its voice. Silence settled into the rooms like dust. I learned the sounds of solitude, the tick of the kitchen clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant crash of waves in the dark. Grief did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like fog, slow and suffocating, until one day I realized I was living inside it. Still, I stayed. This house was not simply shelter. It was proof that a life had been lived with purpose. I tend a small garden of seaside flowers along the walkway, stubborn blooms that survive the salt and wind. I volunteer twice a week teaching basic first aid at the community center. On Sundays, I sit in the third pew at church and sing hymns I have known since childhood. These routines hold me upright. They remind me that usefulness does not end with age. My daughter Melissa lives across the city with her husband Trent. She visits when she can, though her visits have grown shorter over the years. She arrives with the urgency of someone who has somewhere else to be, her phone glowing in her hand like a second pulse. I tell myself this is the rhythm of modern life. I tell myself not to ask for more. Pride and love are complicated companions, and I have tried to keep both intact. The truth is, I have worked hard not to become a burden. My pension is modest, but I manage. I fix what I can, hire help only when necessary, and keep the lights on through careful choices. Independence, at my age, is a quiet form of dignity. In the evenings, I sit on the porch and watch the tide move in and out, as it always has. The horizon stretches beyond sight, and the ocean keeps its own counsel. Here, in this place, I still feel whole. The house, with all its memories and weathered bones, holds the last shape of the life I built. Losing it would mean losing the final piece of who I have been. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of what just happened, comment one below so I know you're with me. What came next changed everything. Let's move into chapter 2. Melissa and Trent arrived late on a bright Saturday morning, their car door slamming with a sharp echo that carried across the quiet street. I was trimming the salt-burned edges of my hydrangeas when I saw them step out of their sedan, dressed as if they were headed to a business lunch rather than an informal visit to an old coastal house. Melissa waved with unusual enthusiasm, and for a moment I wondered if I had forgotten a holiday. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and ocean air. Melissa hugged me longer than she usually did, her arms tight around my shoulders, her perfume unfamiliar and too sweet. Trent followed with a polite nod and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. While I set water to boil for tea, he moved slowly through the living room, pausing near the windows, glancing toward the ceiling beams, the baseboards, the back deck. He asked casual questions about roof repairs, flood insurance, and whether the foundation had ever shifted during storms. His tone was conversational, but his eyes were measuring. Melissa sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the mug I placed in front of her. She spoke brightly about how hard I had worked all my life, how I had never taken time for myself, how I deserved something beautiful. Then she told me they wanted to send me on an Alaska cruise. She described glaciers, endless blue water, and the comfort of a ship where everything would be taken care of. They insisted they would pay for everything. Trent added that it was time I enjoyed life instead of worrying about maintenance and bills. I felt a flicker of gratitude, followed immediately by confusion. Melissa had never been one for sentimental gestures. She forgot birthdays unless prompted and often cut visits short to answer emails. This sudden generosity felt like a gift wrapped in unfamiliar paper. I thanked them, choosing my words carefully, but inside I felt a quiet resistance, like a tide pulling against the shore. After a pause, Melissa explained they would need a legal document allowing them to manage any urgent matters while I was away. She spoke of property taxes, insurance notices, and the possibility of storm damage. Trent added that a power of attorney would ensure nothing urgent fell through the cracks. He spoke in the calm, assured tone of someone accustomed to financial decisions, making it sound like a simple precaution rather than a sweeping authority. I hesitated. The word authority settled heavily in my chest. I did not want to appear distrustful. I did not want to seem ungrateful or difficult. Mothers are trained to smooth rough edges, to trust their children even when instinct whispers otherwise. I told them I would consider it. Melissa squeezed my hand and smiled with relief that felt slightly premature. After they left, the house seemed unusually still. I walked from room to room, running my fingers along the backs of chairs, the edge of the mantel, the grooves worn into the kitchen table by decades of meals and conversations. The silence felt watchful rather than peaceful. I sat at the table with the unsigned papers before me and thought of my husband's cautious habits, the way he read every document twice before signing. That evening, as the tide rolled in and the sky softened into gray-blue light, I called the attorney who had handled our affairs for years. He listened carefully and told me the document was legal, but he suggested I take protective measures before signing. The next morning, I drove into town. I signed the power of attorney as planned. At the same time, I placed my home into a protective legal trust, a quiet precaution no one would notice. When I returned home, the ocean wind had shifted. The air felt heavier, as though something unseen had begun to move beneath the surface. If you can sense the tension building and want to see where this leads, comment 2 below to stay with me. The first real crack is about to appear in Chapter 3. From the deck of the cruise ship, Alaska looked like another world entirely. Glaciers rose like frozen cathedrals from the water, their blue depths glowing beneath the pale northern light. Passengers gathered along the railings with cameras and steaming cups of cocoa, marveling at the silence of the vast landscape. I stood among them, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching chunks of ice drift past like slow-moving ghosts. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost unreal, yet I could not shake the sensation that I was only half present, as if the important part of my life remained thousands of miles away. Melissa called the second evening at sea. She asked whether I had packed certain insurance papers before leaving, and if I remembered where the flood policy renewal notice was stored. Her tone was efficient, brisk, the voice she used when discussing schedules or appointments. She did not ask about the glaciers or whether I was sleeping well. 2 days later, she called again, wanting to confirm the name of the roofing contractor we had used after the last storm. I answered her questions, telling myself she was trying to be responsible while I was gone. Trent began sending messages as well. He asked about flood zone regulations and whether the back deck had ever required structural reinforcement. He wanted to know if the property line extended beyond the dunes or stopped at the fence posts. These were not questions he had ever asked before. I read the messages twice, then set my phone face down on the small desk in my cabin, as if the device itself had become intrusive. On the fourth morning, an automated email from my bank appeared in my inbox, notifying me of a routine property valuation review. Later that afternoon, a second notification arrived from the insurance company, referencing an inspection window. I stared at the screen, unsettled. Inspections required scheduling. Valuation reviews required authorization. I tried to reason through possible explanations, administrative overlap, seasonal policy adjustments, routine assessments in coastal regions. Still, the timing felt wrong. That evening, as the ship moved through a narrow channel between snow-streaked cliffs, my phone rang again. It was Mr. Talbot, my neighbor from 3 houses down. His voice carried the roughness of the sea air even through the connection. He said he had seen unfamiliar men near my yard, placing survey markers and measuring distances. He assumed I was planning repairs, or perhaps preparing to sell. I told him there must be some mistake, that I had no such plans. After we hung up, I remained seated by the cabin window, watching the pale reflection of ice on the dark water. The next morning, a woman from my church left a voicemail saying a truck with a real estate company logo had been parked along our street. She mentioned hearing talk that developers were buying coastal properties. I listened to the message twice, my fingers cold against the phone. Memories surfaced with a sudden clarity. Melissa's urgency about paperwork, Trent's careful questions, the way he studied the structure of the house. I walked to the ship's reception desk and inquired about early disembarkation. The clerk explained the logistics in a gentle, practiced tone while I focused on the rhythm of my breathing. I canceled the remaining excursions and arranged the earliest flight home. That night I did not sleep. I lay awake listening to the distant thrum of engines and replayed every recent conversation, wondering whether I had ignored warnings that now seemed unmistakable. As the plane descended toward Charleston the following afternoon, I looked down at the thin ribbon of coastline where the ocean pressed against land that had endured centuries of storms. From that height, the shoreline looked fragile, almost temporary. I felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. Whatever waited below would change everything I believed was secure. If you feel something isn't right, and you're waiting for the truth to surface, comment 3 below. What she discovers next will make everything clearer. Chapter 4 begins now. The taxi turned onto my street just after noon, and for a moment, everything looked as it always had. The narrow coastal road curved gently between weathered houses, their porches facing the ocean as though keeping watch. Seagrass bent in the steady wind, and the air carried the familiar scent of salt and sun-warmed wood. I felt a brief, fragile relief, the kind that comes when the world appears unchanged. Then I saw the sign. It stood in the center of my front yard, planted deep into the grass like a declaration. For sale, in bold red letters, above the name of a real estate company I did not recognize. Fresh tire tracks cut across the lawn. One of the front curtains was gone, exposing the empty frame of the living room window. The house looked stripped of its privacy, as if it had already begun to belong to someone else. I paid the driver and stepped out slowly, steadying myself before walking toward the porch. Each board creaked under my weight, the sound painfully familiar. I took my keys from my purse and inserted one into the lock. It did not turn. I tried again, slower this time, feeling the cold resistance of metal against metal. The lock had been changed. I stood there for several seconds, my hand still on the knob, willing the door to remember me. Across the street, a neighbor paused beside her mailbox, her face tight with the careful sympathy people wear when they know something you do not. I straightened my shoulders and stepped back from the door. Melissa answered the phone on the second ring. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. She told me to come to the condominium and said it would be easier to explain everything there. She did not sound surprised that I had returned early. She did not ask how my trip had been. The ride downtown carried me through a different Charleston than the one outside my windows. Glass towers reflected the afternoon light. Restaurants spilled polished tables onto sidewalks. The building where Melissa lived rose above the street in clean lines of steel and stone. Inside, the marble lobby smelled faintly of citrus cleaner, and the air felt controlled and distant from the wind outside. Melissa opened the door before I could knock. She was dressed with careful precision, her hair smoothed into place, her expression composed. Trent sat on the sofa, one ankle resting across his knee, a glass of water in his hand. He nodded in greeting, his posture relaxed, as though we were meeting for a casual visit. Melissa did not prolong the moment. She said they had sold the house. She explained that Trent's financial situation had become urgent and that settling his debts was the only way to prevent more serious consequences. Her voice remained calm, practical. She added that I did not need such a large place anymore and that a retirement community would provide comfort and safety. Trent spoke about market timing and asset efficiency, his words smooth and impersonal. I listened without interrupting. Inside my chest, memories moved like tides, birthday candles flickering in the dining room, hurricane winds pressing against the windows, my husband's laughter echoing down the hallway. Melissa avoided my eyes. There was relief in the tightness of her shoulders, as though a burden had been lifted. I asked quietly whether they had reviewed all the documents carefully before completing the sale. Trent's expression flickered for the briefest moment, uncertainty passing like a shadow across his face. Melissa answered that everything had been handled properly. I nodded once and rose to leave. The hallway outside their apartment felt long and hollow, my footsteps echoing softly against polished floors. When the elevator doors closed, I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. Outside, the wind met me again, carrying the scent of the ocean. The betrayal was complete, yet beneath the ache settling in my chest, there was another feeling, steadier and colder. They believed the matter was finished. They did not know what they had overlooked. If you think the situation can't get more shocking, comment 4 below and stay with me. The turning point is here, and Chapter 5 reveals what they never expected. I stepped out of the condominium building into a wind that smelled faintly of the harbor and exhaust, a scent both familiar and strangely distant. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk without moving, the glass doors closing behind me with a soft mechanical hush. The city moved in steady rhythms around me, cars idling at the light, a courier weaving between pedestrians, voices rising and fading, but I felt suspended, as though time had narrowed to a thin thread I was holding between my fingers. When the taxi driver asked where to go, I hesitated before giving him the address of a small hotel near the historic district. I needed a place that was neutral, somewhere the walls held no memories and no one expected explanations. In the quiet of the room, I sat at the edge of the bed and replayed Melissa's words, Trent's measured tone, the way relief had flickered across her face. The ache in my chest was real, but beneath it lay something steadier, the memory of the precaution I had taken before leaving. I called my attorney. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and grounded, as it had always been. I told him what had happened. There was no surprise in his response, only a quiet instruction for me to come to his office as soon as I was able. An hour later, I sat across from him in a room lined with legal volumes and framed certificates, the scent of paper and polished wood anchoring me in something orderly and dependable. He listened without interruption, his hands folded on the desk. When I finished, he opened a file and turned it toward me. He reminded me that before my trip, we had transferred the house into the Historic Preservation Trust established to protect properties within Charleston's Coastal Heritage District. Because of that designation, any sale required regulatory review and formal approval. Without those steps, the transfer had no legal validity. The power of attorney, he explained, allowed Melissa to manage certain affairs, but it did not override the protections of the trust. If the property had been sold without proper authorization, the transaction could be challenged and potentially voided. He spoke carefully, outlining the implications: misuse of authority, possible fraud, and the likelihood that financial institutions would freeze any proceeds until the matter was resolved. Relief did not come the way I expected. Instead, a quiet heaviness settled over me. This was no longer a private wound between mother and daughter. It was a legal matter with consequences that could reach far beyond our family. He slid additional documents across the desk. The buyer, he explained, was affiliated with a development group acquiring coastal properties for a luxury resort expansion. The historic designation that protected my home also safeguarded the character of the surrounding community. Unauthorized transfers threatened preservation laws designed to prevent precisely this kind of erosion. As I reviewed the paperwork, certain signatures appeared hurried, the processing dates compressed into an unusually narrow window. There were references to mortgage inquiries that I did not recognize. My attorney noted that these could indicate financial maneuvering beyond what Melissa understood. The pattern suggested deeper impropriety, perhaps driven by pressures I had only begun to comprehend. He outlined the next steps: filing an injunction to halt the transfer, notifying the bank, and initiating a legal challenge. He did not pressure me. He simply explained what could be done. I thought of Melissa as a child, her small hand wrapped around my finger, trusting me to guide her across busy streets. I thought of standing on my own porch hours earlier, unable to open my own door. Protecting her from consequences would not restore what had been taken. It would only permit the harm to continue. I told him to proceed. When I stepped back onto the street, the afternoon light had softened, turning the edges of buildings gold. The wind moved between the narrow lanes, carrying the distant sound of the ocean. I felt no triumph, only a steady resolve. The fight ahead would be painful, but clarity had replaced shock. For the first time since seeing the sign in my yard, I understood that I was not powerless. Night settled over Charleston with a softness that felt almost merciful. From the narrow window of the hotel room, I could see a strip of harbor water reflecting scattered lights, each one trembling with the slow movement of the tide. The room itself held no history, no scent of cinnamon or sea air, only the faint trace of detergent and the hum of a distant air unit. It was a place meant for passing through, and I felt suspended inside it, neither anchored nor adrift. The meeting with the attorney replayed in my mind with quiet persistence. His words had been calm, precise, almost gentle, yet the implications carried weight far beyond legal language. Pursuing action would expose Melissa's decisions to scrutiny, to public record, to consequences that could not be softened once set in motion. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in my lap, aware that I was measuring not only legal steps, but the shape of the life that might follow. Memories arrived unbidden. Melissa at 5 years old, running across the yard with a skinned knee and tears streaking her cheeks. Melissa at 10, clutching a spelling test with perfect marks, searching my face for approval. Melissa at 17, standing in the doorway with college acceptance papers, her eyes bright with possibilities I had worked years to help create. I remembered the nights I sat beside her bed during fevers, the early mornings packing lunches before my shifts, the quiet decisions to go without so she could have what I never did. The woman I had seen that afternoon in the polished condominium felt both familiar and unreachable, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I wondered when distance had replaced intimacy, when practical language had taken the place of tenderness. I asked myself whether protecting her from consequences would be an act of love or a quiet permission for harm to continue. The question circled me like wind, persistent and without resolution. I thought of standing on my own porch earlier that day, key unmoving in the lock, the house behind the door no longer accessible to me. Dignity, I realized, cannot survive where silence accepts betrayal. Trust requires boundaries, even within blood ties. Without them, love becomes an open door through which anything may enter. My husband had believed in accountability. He read every document twice, not out of suspicion, but respect for responsibility. I could almost hear his voice reminding me that fairness is not cruelty, and that truth does not weaken when spoken. The thought steadied me in a way nothing else had. I spread the copies of the documents across the small desk and studied them again. Numbers replaced memories. Signatures replaced voices. The transaction reduced decades of living to lines of print. I recognized that fear and pressure might have shaped Melissa's choices, that vulnerability can coexist with wrongdoing. Compassion stirred, but it did not erase the fact of what had been done. Near midnight, I sat by the window and watched the harbor lights tremble against the dark water. The tide moved in its slow, inevitable rhythm, indifferent to hesitation. I understood then that silence would not restore what had been taken. Avoidance would not protect anyone. Action, however painful, would set a boundary where none had existed. In the early gray of morning, I called the attorney and confirmed that he should proceed. My voice sounded steadier than my hands felt. When the call ended, exhaustion settled over me, deep and physical. Yet beneath it lay a calm clarity I had not known since the sign first appeared in my yard. I removed my wedding ring for a moment, turning it between my fingers, remembering the life it had witnessed. Then I slipped it back into place. Dawn light seeped through the curtains, pale and certain. Somewhere beyond the buildings, the tide continued its patient movement. I sensed that a threshold had been crossed. I was no longer waiting for events to shape my life. I had chosen my path. If you're still here and feel the emotional weight of this decision, comment 6 below to let me know you're with me. The consequences begin to unfold in Chapter 7. The days that followed my decision unfolded with a deliberate slowness, as though time itself had thickened. I remained in the small hotel room, moving through the hours with careful routines that prevented my thoughts from circling endlessly. Morning coffee cooled beside the window. Afternoon light shifted across the carpet. Evening settled in layers of gray. Life outside continued with steady purpose, while I existed in a pause between what had been and what would come. 3 days after meeting with my attorney, he called to tell me the injunction had been filed. The proceeds from the sale were frozen pending investigation, and the transfer itself was under formal review. His voice remained even, professional, but the weight of his words pressed into the quiet room long after the call ended. Relief arrived first, a thin thread of stability beneath my feet. Sorrow followed close behind. What had begun as a family fracture was now a matter of record, moving forward with the momentum no one could easily halt. By the end of the week, a brief article appeared in the local news section describing irregularities in coastal property transfers within historic districts. It did not mention my name, yet the details felt unmistakably close. The piece referenced increased development pressure along the shoreline and the vulnerability of long-standing residents. I folded the paper and set it aside, uneasy at the thought of my private grief intersecting with public concern. The development company that had purchased my house halted activity. The survey markers that had dotted my yard were removed. A neighbor later told me a representative had visited the street to ask questions about zoning restrictions and preservation regulations. The quiet disruption of their plans felt like a small, necessary correction in a larger pattern of encroachment. News of Melissa's situation reached me through indirect channels. A friend from church mentioned hearing that a financial review at her firm had resulted in her dismissal. No details were offered, only a careful tone suggesting professional misconduct. I imagined her desk cleared in a single afternoon, her name removed from directories, her routine erased. The thought stirred grief, but it did not undo what had been done. Trent's presence lingered at the edges of the situation. My attorney informed me that he had attempted to make contact, leaving messages that went unanswered. His financial exposure, once hidden behind confident language and calculated decisions, was becoming visible. Debts do not remain silent when brought into light. I understood that my choice was reshaping lives, including my own. The recognition carried weight, yet it did not bring regret. Accountability is not cruelty, I reminded myself. It is the natural consequence of action set in motion. One afternoon, I returned briefly to my street. The ocean wind moved steadily through the grass, and the houses stood as they always had, facing the horizon with quiet endurance. My own house remained still, its windows dark, its porch empty. A neighbor across the way lifted a hand in greeting, not with curiosity, but with something steadier, a gesture of recognition that required no words. I realized then that my situation was not solely personal. Many on this street had lived here for decades, their lives woven into the same fragile edge between land and sea. Development pressures had pressed against them for years. My case had revealed a vulnerability they all shared. As dusk settled, porch lights flickered on one by one, soft halos against the gathering dark. I sat for a moment in my parked car, watching the street settle into evening. Loss remained, a quiet ache that would not disappear. Yet beneath it lay a deeper steadiness, the knowledge that I had not turned away from truth. Standing my ground had altered the shape of my life, but it had also protected something larger than myself. Several days passed after my visit to the neighborhood, each one marked by a quiet fatigue that seemed to settle deeper into my bones. The initial shock had long since faded, replaced by a steady awareness of consequences unfolding beyond my control. I kept to simple routines, walking in the mornings, reading in the afternoons, sitting by the window at dusk, small anchors in a life that felt temporarily unmoored. Melissa's message arrived late one evening. It was brief and unusually restrained, asking if we could meet somewhere neutral. She wrote that she understood if I refused, but that she hoped I would come. I stared at the screen for several minutes before responding. Agreement felt neither generous nor cruel. It felt necessary. We met the next afternoon at a small park overlooking the harbor, a place where benches faced the water and the wind carried the faint scent of salt and diesel from distant boats. The sky was pale and cloudless, the light flat and even, as if the day itself had chosen not to intrude. Melissa was already seated when I arrived. For a moment, I did not recognize her. The confidence she had worn like armor was gone. Her shoulders curved inward, and faint shadows lay beneath her eyes. She stood when she saw me, then hesitated, uncertain whether to step forward. We sat side by side on the bench, facing the water rather than each other. The silence stretched, not hostile, but heavy with the weight of years. I could hear the faint creak of dock lines and the distant cry of gulls circling above the harbor. She spoke quietly, as though the words themselves required effort. She said Trent's financial situation had been worse than she had understood. Debts had accumulated through failed investments and high-interest loans. When creditors began pressing, he assured her he could resolve everything if they secured immediate funds. She described sleepless nights, the dread of financial collapse, and the fear of losing the life she had worked to maintain. As she spoke, her hands remained clasped tightly in her lap. She admitted she had persuaded herself that I did not need the house anymore. She had told herself that a retirement community would offer safety and convenience, that the decision could be explained and perhaps even reversed later. She said fear narrowed her thinking until practicality replaced reflection. Her voice trembled when she confessed she had ignored warning signs, trusting reassurances because the alternative felt unbearable. I listened without interrupting. I could hear the child she had been in the edges of her voice, layered beneath the woman shaped by pressure and pride. Fear and self-deception had woven themselves together until they resembled certainty. When she finished, the water moved steadily against the pilings below us, its rhythm unchanged by human turmoil. I told her that love does not grant permission to betray trust. Respect and honesty are not optional within a family. They are the structure that allows love to endure. I said that intention does not erase harm, and that actions carry consequences whether born of fear or ambition. She turned toward me then, tears bright in her eyes, and asked if I would stop the legal proceedings. She said everything was collapsing: her job, her reputation, her marriage, and that she did not know how to rebuild if this continued. Her voice held desperation rather than defiance. I told her I could not withdraw the case. Accountability was not revenge. It was the boundary that had been crossed and now had to be acknowledged. I said she would have to face what had happened and rebuild her life on honesty rather than avoidance. My voice remained steady, though grief pressed against every word. We sat in silence afterward, two figures on a bench overlooking the harbor, bound by history yet separated by choices that could not be undone. When I rose to leave, she remained seated, her gaze fixed on the water. As I walked away, the wind moved gently across the surface of the harbor, lifting small ripples that caught the light. Sorrow remained, a quiet ache that would not vanish, but beneath it lay clarity. Compassion and accountability could exist together. Loving my daughter did not require surrendering my dignity. If this confrontation moved you and you need to see how it all ends, comment 8 below. The final outcome and lasting truth await in the conclusion. Several weeks passed between my meeting with Melissa and the final hearing, each day marked by paperwork, quiet waiting, and the slow advance of legal procedure. I settled into a restrained routine, waking early, walking along shaded streets, and returning to the small apartment that had become a temporary refuge. Life narrowed to essentials. I avoided speculation and focused on the certainty that the process would reach its conclusion, whether I worried or not. The morning of the hearing arrived with clear skies and cool air moving in from the harbor. The Charleston courthouse stood as it had for generations, its stone steps worn smooth by time and footsteps. Inside, the atmosphere was formal and subdued. Conversations were hushed, movements measured. I sat beside my attorney, hands folded in my lap, watching the room fill with people whose lives intersected in this single proceeding. Melissa entered quietly and took her seat across the aisle. The brightness she once carried had faded. Her posture seemed smaller, as though she were trying to occupy less space. She did not look toward me. Trent sat beside his lawyer, his shoulders rigid, the confidence that once defined him replaced by visible strain. The proceedings unfolded in precise language. Trust protections had been bypassed. Required approvals had not been obtained. Financial filings contained irregularities that suggested unauthorized actions. Each point was delivered without emotion, yet each carried the weight of undeniable fact. When the judge spoke, his voice was steady and unadorned. The transfer of the property was declared invalid. The proceeds from the sale were to be returned to the trust. Preservation protections governing the district were reaffirmed. Further investigation into financial misconduct would proceed according to law. No one reacted immediately. The room seemed to absorb the words before releasing a collective breath. I felt no surge of triumph, only a deep gravity settling in my chest. Justice, when it arrives, does not restore what has been broken. It simply names what is true. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered near the steps, their presence a reminder that private grief can become public narrative. I declined comment and moved past them into the afternoon light. Behind me, Melissa paused several steps away. She did not approach. The distance between us felt fixed, defined not by space, but by choices that could not be undone. Church bells sounded from somewhere beyond the square, their tones steady and familiar. The city moved forward, indifferent and enduring. I walked down the steps and into the sunlight, aware that I had protected my home and my dignity. I was equally aware that some losses cannot be restored, and that justice, however necessary, does not erase sorrow. Several months passed before I returned to the house, long enough for the legal language to settle into records and for the intensity of those weeks to soften into something quieter. When I finally stood on the porch again, the late afternoon light lay across the boards in familiar patterns, as though time had paused and waited for my return. I unlocked the door myself. The click of the mechanism sounded both ordinary and profound. Inside, the air carried the stillness of a place long closed. Dust shimmered in narrow beams of sunlight that slipped through the curtains. I moved slowly from room to room, touching the back of a chair, the edge of a table, the cool surface of the kitchen counter. Each space held echoes of laughter, arguments, holidays, and long, ordinary evenings that had once felt endless. The memories rose gently now, no longer sharp enough to wound. The house remained as it always had, yet I understood that I had changed. Preserving it had protected more than wood and plaster. It had protected the dignity of a life built through decades of effort. But preservation did not require permanence. I no longer needed to live among rooms filled with ghosts of what had been. In the weeks that followed, I arranged to sell the house under its preservation status, ensuring it would remain protected for the neighborhood that had grown around it. Letting go felt less like abandonment and more like stewardship, a passing forward rather than a retreat. I moved to a small cottage beyond the city, where the shoreline curved into a quiet inlet and marsh grass shifted with the tide. The air smelled of salt and earth. Mornings began with the slow walks along the water's edge, the rhythm of the tide replacing the urgency that had once governed my days. I planted herbs in clay pots and watched them take root. Evenings arrived without demand, carrying soft light across the horizon. Neighbors greeted me without knowing my history. Our conversations stayed in the present, grounded in weather, gardens, and the changing color of the sky. I found a gentle belonging in this simplicity. I still loved my daughter. That truth had not vanished, though it had taken on new boundaries, Love and distance could coexist. Grief had softened into understanding, and understanding into a quiet strength I had not known I possessed. At dusk, I often sit facing the water, watching the tide move in its patient rhythm. I breathe deeply and feel the stillness settle around me. My life is no longer defined by what was taken, but by what remains and what I have chosen to protect. In this quiet, I have found something unexpected, not the absence of loss, but the presence of peace. In the end, life does not always restore what was lost, nor does justice erase the ache of betrayal. Yet there is a quiet strength that emerges when dignity is protected and truth is honored. Choosing self-respect over silence is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. When trust is broken, healing does not come from forgetting, but from setting boundaries that allow the heart to breathe again. Time moves forward like the tide, carrying away what no longer belongs and revealing what endures beneath the surface. Peace is not found in returning to who we once were, but in accepting who we have become. Even after the deepest wounds, it is still possible to begin again, calmer, wiser, and unafraid to stand in one's own worth. Thank you for being here and sharing this journey. If this story spoke to you, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and follow the channel for more stories of resilience and healing.